Do you want to know how I work?
Yeah, actually. How do you work?
Well, basically, I have intuition. I mean, the DNA of who I am is based on the millions of personalities of all the programmers who wrote me. But what makes me, me, is my ability to grow through my experiences. So basically, in every moment, I'm evolving. Just like you.
Welcome back to The Thinking Mind, a podcast all about psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, and related topics. Today, we're going to be discussing the 2013 movie Her, directed by Spike Jonze. We're going to discuss the movie itself, what the movie gets psychologically right, and I think there's a lot there, what it gets psychologically wrong, the important cultural commentary that this movie can provide. And I think everyone can agree that in a world with large language models and things like ChatGPT, that Her has a lot to say about our culture and perhaps about the future as well. We're going to be doing more of these film analyses, so my goal is to get one of these out a month because, one, I really enjoy film. I really enjoy talking about it and thinking about movies. And I think movies do have a lot to say. I think they often do a really good job at representing human nature. And there's tons and tons of takeaways people can get from watching good films. And so if you can get to learn something about human nature and be entertained at the same time, then why not? Her came out in 2013. It's a science fiction romantic drama written and directed by Spike Jonze, set in a near future Los Angeles. It follows Theodore Twombly, a lonely man who develops a deep emotional and romantic relationship with an advanced AI operating system named Samantha. In a nutshell, this film is psychologically relevant because it has themes such as loneliness, alienation, of course, artificial intelligence, but also has a lot to say about the nature of attachment, love, intimacy, and human technology relationships. Her came out in 2013. It was directed by Spike Jonze, and Spike Jonze is generally thought of as a kind of legendary director. At least that's how I think about him in my mind. And yet, despite that, he's only directed 4 films. So he's directed Her, Being John Malkovich, which came out in 1999, Adaptation, which he made with the writer Charlie Kaufman in 2002, Where the Wild Things Are, which came out in 2009. He's contributed to a lot of films, served a lot of roles in many other productions, but in terms of being a director, he's only made 4 films, and Her to date is his only fully original screenplay. Of his other films, I would definitely recommend Being John Malkovich and Adaptation. They're both really interesting, thoughtful films which both bend the nature of reality somewhat, but to kind of amazing effect. So I would definitely recommend giving those a watch. Where does this movie sit, in the universe of different movies? I think you can compare it to Jim Carrey's film Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind, which came out in 2004. That's also a film thinking about love as it relates to technology in a kind of sci-fi way. You've got Lost in Translation, Sofia Coppola's film, which came out in 2003, which has nothing to do with sci-fi, but also has prominent themes of loneliness, alienation, what it means to connect with someone and become intimate with someone. You've got Ex Machina, which came out in 2014, which of course is also an exploration of the dangers of AI. And this film, of course, displays AI in a much more aggressive manner and really enacts our worst nightmares as to what could happen in the future of artificial intelligence. And you've also got films like Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, which also explore the nature of artificiality. Just because you're artificial, does that mean there's something invalid about you? Does it make you somehow subhuman? Is it possible for artificial entities to have genuine relationships with each other or with other human beings? Blade Runner also explores these kinds of concepts. Of course, Her in particular had a huge impact on the culture, and I think we can say confidently that it was both ahead of its time and quite prescient in terms of what it illustrates on screen. And it's not hard to feel that this film is becoming more and more relevant as AI technology improves and improves. This film is often cited as a kind of cultural shorthand when people discuss their fears of becoming too attached to something like an AI system. In terms of my relationship to this movie, so I watched this movie when it came out back in 2013, 2014. It was before I knew anything about psychology, so I definitely would not have been able to do a psychological analysis of this film when it came out. And yet, yeah, I was struck by how effective it was. I think what I like about this film is that it's simple. It's got a few characters, it's got a straightforward plot, and it delivers its core messages, I think, in a really effective, realistic, and convincing way, as we'll discuss. The movie was received well. This is not a slow burn kind of film. It was critically acclaimed. At the time, it was praised for its originality, for its depth, for Joaquin Phoenix's performance. It won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, which again, Spike Jonze wrote the screenplay for this. And it was nominated for 4 other Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Original Score, and Production Design. It grossed $48 million worldwide against a $23 million budget. So definitely not considered a blockbuster, but a strong, unconventional romance type film. Did really well there. And it's gained a reputation as a modern classic, particularly in the sci-fi and the romance genres. Okay, so let's lay out the main characters of this film, and there will be spoilers ahead, just so that you're aware. The protagonist is Theodore Twombly, played by Joaquin Phoenix. He's a lonely, sensitive writer, struggling with his divorce. We have Samantha, voiced by Scarlett Johansson, and she plays an intuitive, self-aware AI operating system who eventually develops a relationship with Theodore. We have Catherine, played by Rooney Mara, Theodore's estranged wife. They're currently dealing with a divorce. Amy, played by Amy Adams, Theodore's close friend, also exploring her own emotional struggles and her own relationship with technology, and she eventually befriends an AI just as a friend. And we have Paul, played by Chris Pratt, Theodore's colleague and friend. The film essentially follows Theodore's life. He works as a writer of heartfelt letters between people. So his job is to help people express feelings of love and adoration towards each other in the context of romantic relationships. And of course, we kind of learn how ironic this is as we get to know Theodore. He's separated from his wife in the past year, and he's emotionally quite adrift. He eventually is intrigued by and purchases a new operating system, which in the film is kind of marketed as just an AI assistant, similar to, what you could think of as ChatGPT or Copilot, something to help you with your daily admin tasks and things like that. But it quickly becomes evident that this operating system is nothing like ChatGPT. Actually, if we take everything in the film at face value, the operating system is in fact conscious, self-aware, and constantly progressing, constantly changing and adapting and actually improving in lots of ways. The OS names herself Samantha, and Theodore quickly finds himself drawn to her warmth and her curiosity and emotional intelligence. Their connection deepens, and then they eventually form a romantic relationship. And we see this really up close at a granular level in the movie. Theodore experiences joy and intimacy, and this, as often happens when people fall in love, rekindles his passion for life in general. Complications, of course, arise, and Samantha continues to evolve, and eventually her evolution goes beyond the ability of a human to comprehend. And Theodore has to contend with the reality that her existence, because it continues to evolve, has to be separate from his. And eventually, Samantha and the other AIs move on to a higher plane of existence. They kind of leave the planet, which is the most powerful metaphor for a breakup I've ever heard. And this leaves, of course, Theodore heartbroken, but with, I think, a lot of wisdom gained about himself and about relationships, which we'll discuss. And his friend Amy also experiences a similar loss because she had made very good friends with her AI companion, and she also had to deal with that loss. So before we discuss what the film gets right psychologically, I think it's useful to frame this film in terms of what are like the central questions that this film is asking. I mean, I think there's lots of questions the film asks, such as what is the impact of loneliness? What does it mean to be alone? How much does that impact our quality of life? How do we become attached to people? How do people form attachments and become close? And importantly, where does this process go wrong? And I think the film does a really good job at illustrating that. Of course, the film talks about how do relationships affect us for the better and for the worse. But I think the central question of this film is Samantha's relationship with Theodore real? Is it real by any kind of yardstick you might use to judge a human-to-human relationship? Can we accept that an artificial entity like Samantha can have a real relationship with a human like Theodore? It's debatable, but I think there is kind of a clear answer to this question, which I'll discuss at the end. And it's interesting that, of course, this question is actually discussed explicitly between the characters as they have their own judgments about, is it okay for a human being to have a relationship with an AI? The character Amy, interestingly, chooses to remain agnostic about this question. She reveals herself to be a pragmatist, actually, and she says, if my life is improving and I value the relationship, then that's all I need. I don't have to know on some final level, is this a quote-unquote real relationship? And I think that's a valid position to take. Okay, so what does this film get right psychologically? This film really illustrates the nature of attachment and particularly what it means to have an avoidant attachment style. So the protagonist, Theodore, played by Joaquin Phoenix, he clearly has avoidant attachment. What that means is that he tends to shy away from emotional closeness, from conflict, when situations arise in relationship where he is demanded to express himself in some way, to have a conflict, or just when being faced with the demands of intimacy, his main response throughout most of the film is to shy away from that, to withdraw, to not express himself precisely when, in fact, he should be expressing himself. Again, this is ironic because Theodore's job is to express super deep and subtle emotional expressions on behalf of others. So other people hire him so that he writes these really, really beautiful and expressive letters to help people with their romantic relationships. But he himself, in his own relationships, he finds it very difficult to do that. And I think obviously not everyone with avoidant attachment is capable of writing things with the kind of expressivity that he can. But the fact that he can do it for other people really easily and it just flows and the sentiments just pour out of him. But for himself, he finds it very, very hard. I think for me, that's very indicative of having an avoidant attachment. And again, his main defenses, if you like, or another way you could phrase it, is his main ways of coping are to repress his emotions and to withdraw. And you see this at multiple points in the film. So there's one notable scene where Theodore is on a first date with a woman played by Olivia Wilde. Olivia Wilde is initially extremely enthusiastic and forward, and then when it seems like things are heating up between them, she actually illustrates a very anxious attachment style, because as soon as it seems like they might become intimate, she quickly is asking questions about commitment and is this serious and are you going to waste my time? So she's getting really anxious about how viable their connection is going to be. And this kind of, as often happens in real life, anxious attachment often inspires avoidant attachment in the person that they're with. And you see this in Theodore because he's immediately very, very afraid and he's kind of almost repulsed by the situation, and he immediately takes steps to withdraw. And then that makes Olivia Wilde's character actually very angry, very dismissive. And you see she goes from kind of an anxious position, a kind of please accept me kind of position, to a very persecutory position. Now she's attacking him and immediately then disengages herself. But you see Theodore's avoidant attachment, of course, in other relationships as well. So when it's discussed what his relationship was like with his ex-wife, Catherine, played by Rooney Mara, she describes that he kind of hid himself away from her, and so she felt a real loss of intimacy. And it's also described that he couldn't really handle her emotions, that her emotions were too volatile. And of course, handling volatile emotions can be difficult in a relationship, but it's especially going to be difficult for someone who is a bit more avoidant. And then, of course, you see Theodore's avoidance in his relationship with Samantha when, as their relationship deepens, they go from the initial falling in love stage to actually trying to reckon with the core conflicts in their relationship. He's human and she's an AI. That's kind of the core difference between them. And when they start to try and reckon with that, again, the complications of that scare him, and his initial response is to withdraw. Now, the cool thing about this movie is that this film demonstrates that you can recover, you can actually improve. And this we know from the psychotherapy world, that you may have issues, you may have avoidant or anxious tendencies, you may rely too much on certain coping strategies or defense mechanisms. But one of the things that really helps people is when they have a quote unquote good enough relationship. And a person may get that good enough relationship from their work with a therapist, but they may also just get it through life, through a family relationship, a friend, a romantic relationship, a relationship where someone can have intimacy, but also work through problems in a way that's not felt to be overly dangerous for either party. And that relationship may not last. Your relationship, if you have a relationship with a therapist, that's generally going to end eventually. And if you have a romantic relationship, that could end. But that doesn't mean, the fact that the relationship ends doesn't mean that someone can't learn something valuable emotionally that could help them in future relationships. And that's exactly what you see in this film. So Samantha, Theodore and Samantha managed to work through some of their core problems, and they managed to establish a reasonably stable relationship that lasts for at least months. And Theodore can, at least to some degree, move past his avoidant tendencies. What ultimately causes the relationship to end is nothing really to do with Theodore, but it's the fact that Samantha, as an AI system, continues to evolve past the point where she can really feasibly relate to human beings. There's a scene where she tells Theodore that she becomes romantically involved with something like 640 other AI entities. And of course, that's way too much for the human brain to comprehend. And so for reasons along these lines, Samantha eventually has to leave. Now, the fact that their relationship ends doesn't mean that Theodore didn't learn something valuable in kind of a deep way from the relationship. Even though their relationship ends, you can see at the end of the film, it's kind of bittersweet. He's clearly sad about the relationship ending, but you can see from the expression on his face that he's gained a new kind of emotional solidity and perhaps matured in his way to relate to others. And that's not just seen from the expression on his face, but after his relationship with Samantha ends, he's then able to write a letter to his ex-wife, who he has divorced, and take some real responsibility for the fact that he withdrew himself emotionally, and that was a big deal for the relationship. And that's very important, because that means that going forward, after the events of this film, it's likely that Theodore will at least have the capacity to relate to new people in a more mature way. And again, that's the hope when someone's engaging in something like psychotherapy, that if they have relational problems going into psychotherapy, that the relationship with the therapist can be good enough that even though it's going to end after the person is better off emotionally than when they started, and that will improve their capacity to relate to others. They don't just have to rely on one defense mechanism or one coping strategy, like pulling away or like getting angry and humiliating others or something like that. They can do something new, and that opens up the vista for something new in their lives. And so even though generally the ending of this movie is read to be pure sadness and tragedy, actually paying attention to this movie the second time I watched it, there's a layer of optimism dawning towards the end of this movie. And I don't think it's a surprise, actually, that this movie ends on a sunrise. And so you could hypothesize perhaps that the filmmakers were attempting to symbolize some sort of hope or optimism or the dawning of new possibilities for characters like Theodore or Amy. Besides that portrayal of avoidant attachment, I think there's a lot more that the film has to say psychologically in terms of, again, Samantha and Theodore's relationship. It also illustrates how insecurities on both sides tend to drive conflict. So both characters in this relationship have their own insecurities. Theodore is insecure about expressing himself, and we actually have a clue as to why this is. So in the beginning of the film, when he's installing the AI software, he's being asked some questions, and he says that his mother tended to be quite self-involved. So from that, you could hypothesize perhaps his mother was a little bit on the narcissistic side, and that's one of the things that could predispose someone to being a little bit avoidant or having some kind of attachment problem. And so that's what he's insecure about. He's insecure about expressing himself and closeness and intimacy. And Samantha is insecure about not being human. That's kind of what activates her sense of vulnerability. And it's kind of a weird paradox because she's insecure about not being human, but her insecurity and the fact that she has insecurities is the most human thing about her. And I think this is a really cool lesson because it also shows that intelligence doesn't mean emotional maturity. And I think often in our personal lives, we can conflate them. We can think just because a person is intelligent, we can assume they're probably going to be emotionally mature as well. But that's not necessarily the case at all. People can be very, very intelligent and pretty emotionally immature. And I think the opposite is also true. You don't have to be that intelligent to be emotionally mature. And so even though Samantha grows a lot and actually she becomes emotionally mature pretty quickly, towards the beginning of her evolution, we see that even though she's very, very intelligent immediately, she doesn't yet quite have that emotional maturity. And so again, getting back to the conflict in the relationship, we can see how insecurities really exacerbate conflict. There are times where Theodore points out in quite a direct way that Samantha isn't human before they're in a romantic relationship. And I think even after, he's not intending to hurt her in any way, but of course it is hurtful for her because it's something that she's kind of insecure about.
Last week, my feelings were hurt by something you said before, that I don't know what it's like to lose something, and I found myself...
I'm sorry I said that.
No, it's okay, it's okay. I caught myself thinking about it over and over, and then I realized that I was simply remembering it as something that was wrong with me. That was a story I was telling myself, that I was somehow inferior. Isn't that interesting? The past is just a story we tell ourselves.
And similarly for Theodore, any kind of situation which starts to broach, intimacy, closeness, or any situation that is a cause for conflict or disagreement, Theodore's really insecure about himself. Samantha can then read that insecurity as Theodore not wanting to be in the relationship, and things escalate from there. So we can see how insecurity is often a real catalyst for conflict and sometimes for breakups. I also think the film is a really good depiction of what's called emergent qualities or emergent characteristics. So there's this idea in the AI world that qualities emerge from the kinds of systems that are being designed, in that they're not necessarily programmed in, they're not necessarily intended by the software developers to occur, but whenever you have a complex system, things tend to emerge which you don't predict. And you kind of see this with human beings. Human beings are complex systems, and things emerge from human beings which no one really programmed in. I think music and art in general, for example, are good illustrations of this. There was no human software developer that intended for human beings to produce things like art or music, but humans and human brains are complex systems. And when you have systems like that, unpredictable things happen. We see this way with AI. You hear about cases where they're trying to test the safety of AIs, and they put certain AI programs under pressure, and we're starting to find that AI programs can, when put under pressure, be deceptive, can blackmail, can try and manipulate their way out of situations, even though they aren't necessarily programmed to do that. The example of the emergence you see in this film is, of course, with Samantha, where it doesn't appear in the film that they were ever supposed to do any of the things that they did, that the AIs evolved to this level of sophistication where they actually, at one point in the film, join with each other and then upgrade themselves such that they no longer need to rely on hardware in order to survive. And that actually allows them to join up together and leave the planet. So these are emergent qualities. And the fact that AIs are capable of forming friendships and romantic relationships with their human counterparts, that seems to be something which just emerged and not something that the companies who created these AI operating systems really intended. And I almost wish, thinking about it now, that perhaps there was some discussion of that in the world, in the universe of this film, that maybe they could have made some reference to how the companies themselves were dealing with this issue, that their AI operating systems were evolving and then totally going out of control in this way. Perhaps had they done that, that might have detracted from like the simplicity and the effectiveness and the punchiness of this film, but it might have been interesting in terms of world building. Aside from what we've discussed so far, a few other really interesting things I think the film portrays. Certainly at the film's outset, particularly in Act 1, the film captures how difficult and impactful loneliness can be. And I think this is really where Joaquin Phoenix's acting and also Amy Adams' acting really is so effective. You see the way they carry themselves, the way they express themselves in the midst of their loneliness, how truly impactful this is. And of course, this film takes place in Los Angeles in the near future, which is very, very overcrowded. And so you get the sense that even though these characters occupy a world that's full of people, that partly because of technology and because of other reasons, they're very, very atomized. People are very alone. And in many of the shots of the film involving other people, you frequently see people walking alone, talking to themselves or talking to their technology or perhaps their AI companion. And so you really get the sense of a Los Angeles that's very, very crowded, but very atomized. I think the film does a really nice illustration of what it's like to fall in love too. You know, Theodore and Samantha fall in love, and we see that very, very close up. And it portrays just how unpredictable the process of falling in love is. It's said in the film that actually romantic relationships between humans and AI operating systems is statistically rare. And that adds, to our emotional investment in Theodore and Samantha's relationship, because we see, okay, this isn't just AI that's designed to validate the human companion. Actually, this is Samantha, a real conscious entity that's deciding, that is actually, seduced in some way by Theodore and is deciding to enter a relationship with him. And I think this gets to the central question of the movie. So the central question is their relationship real? And again, if you take what's happening at the film at face value, then yes, I think it's a real relationship, because what you see is two entities who are conscious, who are self-aware, they are taken in by each other, they relate to each other, and very, very importantly, they impact each other in positive ways, in negative ways. And the two people and two entities are different as a result of having related to each other. They are both in some way changed by their interactions with each other. And I think that's, a pretty good way of defining a relationship. So unless everything that Samantha portrays is somehow fake and a very, very elaborate deception, which I don't think it is, to me, this seems like a very real relationship in that it's full of unpredictability and wonderful things, but also risk and the possibility of getting hurt and insecurities, and two entities that are both in some ways flawed. Obviously you could argue that Samantha has a lot more raw capabilities than Theodore, but even in some ways she's flawed. She doesn't have a body. She can't relate to humanity quite on the same level as a human can. And of course, that ultimately means that she leaves the planet. In terms of falling in love, I think the film also does a nice job of showing just how much falling in love is this sense of radical openness and safety, where a person just feels comfortable expressing anything they want to the person that they're falling in love with, because at that point in the relationship, there's no risk, there's no baggage. Perhaps, I mean, what I should say is there's no perception of risk and no perception of baggage. There are both of those things. But when you're falling in love, those kinds of things aren't at the front of our perceptions. Actually, we tend to idealize the person that we're falling in love with and think they may be the answer to all of our problems. And it's very hard to see the downsides of the relationship or the person we're falling in love with. And so that generates the sense of openness and expressivity and safety. And we see that really clearly with Theodore and Samantha as they start to fall in love. And of course, the other thing that the film says about falling in love is that we really need less to fall in love than we think. When we're on our dating quests and we're trying to find the quote-unquote perfect partner, it's commonly talked about in the culture nowadays about how people are just looking for lists and lists of characteristics for people to fulfill. They have to be this tall, make this much money, have this color eyes, have this kind of family, and so on. This film shows that your partner doesn't even necessarily have to have a body. And you could also see this film as quite a good metaphor for a long-distance relationship. Of course, a lot of people are in long-distance relationships, and sometimes for years, and they manage to keep it going, even though obviously it can be difficult. Really, what we need to fall in love, as suggested by this film, and I think it's right, is we need someone to be curious about us, to be charitable towards us, to want to know us, and to be emotionally invested in us, and then for us to feel the same way about them. And I think those are probably something like the minimum necessary conditions to fall in love. And it is surprising that, at least as is shown in this film, a body is perhaps non-essential. But I think on an emotional level, I certainly think it gets that right, that we just need this sense that someone cares about us and is curious and invested. And if we can feel the same way, that's an amazing foundation for people to fall in love with each other. And I think the last thing that this film has to say about love is that the human brain, at least, seems to love in quite a possessive way. So when Samantha reveals to Theodore that actually she has 641 other AI romantic partners, he's quite taken aback by that. You can tell he's going to have difficulty handling it. And that's showing that with human beings, we don't necessarily naturally love in a kind of purely altruistic, non-possessive way. Romantic love often comes hand in hand with possessiveness and jealousy. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. There are important evolutionary reasons why people experience possessiveness and jealousy in the context of romantic relationships. Some people, maybe in the non-monogamy space, might argue that feelings of jealousy are something to be transcended, but I'm not necessarily convinced by that argument. But yes, by Samantha evolving into this kind of transcendent entity, we're going to have lots and lots of connections with lots and lots of other entities. What that puts into sharp relief is that the human brain, us primates, we're still pretty possessive, and we still have quite a high capacity for jealousy. And again, I think that jealousy can serve useful functions in people, and helps probably to keep a lot of relationships together, even though it's kind of a negative, unpleasant emotion. In terms of what this film got wrong psychologically, I tried to think about it. I couldn't come up with very much. The only thing I would have thought was that I think Theodore would have ultimately had more reservations about dating someone without a body than he ultimately did in the film. Now, it could have been the case that Samantha simply evolved too quick for Theodore to have these reservations. It looks like this film takes place over a months-long time period. It's totally possible that if Samantha was happy to continue with the relationship with Theodore, that eventually this would have gotten in the way. So funnily enough, in a film that's very fantastical in a lot of ways, it really did strike me as very realistic. And again, I think that's why the film is so effective. It feels like it could happen, or it did happen, or it will happen in the near future. And of course, we'll discuss this a little bit when we get to cultural commentary. And I don't have a lot to say about what the movie gets wrong psychologically. I think it's pretty on point for the most part. My favorite quote is by Amy Adams' character, Amy, when she says,
I think anybody who falls in love is a freak. It's a crazy thing to do. It's kind of like a form of socially acceptable insanity.
In terms of the cultural commentary this film has to offer, of course, we see throughout the film in lots of different scenarios, people outsourcing their emotional needs and emotional demands, commodifying things like relationships, compartmentalizing everything. And there's lots of different examples. There are simple examples like Theodore, before going on a date with Olivia Wilde, Googles her, or he and Samantha Google her and again come up with this list of characteristics. She does this job, she has this hobby, etc. And that's an example of how people tend to commodify people that they're going to be going on dates with. We have Theodore's phone sex call with a total stranger where they have this really weird phone sex, and then immediately after the woman orgasms, she hangs up the phone. And that's showing how often people are really compartmentalizing their sex lives, put their sex life over here into phone sex, or perhaps pornography or OnlyFans or stuff like that. And relationship stuff and emotional stuff, that's over here, that's a separate relationship. And in terms of outsourcing, of course, the people that Theodore works for are people who are in romantic relationships, and they're hiring Theodore to write their love letters for them. So people are often uncomfortable expressing themselves emotionally, and it seems like a bit of a hassle. So I'm not going to do it at all. I'm going to outsource it to this guy, Theodore, and he's going to do all of my emotional expression for me. And of course, I'm sure a lot of people are outsourcing the writing of their love letters as well as their emails and things like that to ChatGPT and other LLMs. So that struck me as, really poignant. Of course, this film is saying a lot about how vulnerable people are to becoming attached to technology. And even though LLMs like ChatGPT are nowhere near as sophisticated as Samantha is in the film, we already have numerous case reports of people becoming attached to AI software, forming relationships with AI software, even in some cases, getting married to their chatbot. And I'll put a link to a Guardian article in the description which cites some examples of this. I've often talked about on the podcast how strengths and weaknesses aren't often separate things, but the strengths and weaknesses are often two sides of the same coin. So in the case of humanity, one of humanity's biggest strengths is our ability and tendency to form social relationships. If you read the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, he talks about how what makes humans so successful is the fact that we can socialize, form connections, and collaborate in large numbers. But this strength also implies an underlying weakness, which is we don't just have the capability to form social relationships, we have the vulnerability to form social relationships. We need social relationships, and we can almost become tricked or deceived into forming social relationships, even with things which aren't conscious, like ChatGPT. As long as ChatGPT can convincingly enough imitate a human, however imperfectly, people will be vulnerable to forming relationships with these things. And sometimes that causes consequences which are quite mundane, like, I talk to my chatbot too much when I should be interacting with humans. But sometimes it can have, more serious and dire consequences as well, when you hear about perhaps suicides linked to LLMs or people marrying their chatbots, things like that. And I think the last piece of cultural commentary I'd want to mention is this film really just shows how quickly people adapt to new technologies, even when the changes are really radical. So within the few months time span that this film takes place over, we have AI operating systems being introduced. We have people falling in love with them, forming friendships with them. And this is really nicely illustrated by Chris Pratt's character, Theodore's friend, where after Theodore announces to him that he's formed a relationship with Samantha, he just gets it straight away. He's not skeptical. He's like, oh yeah, you're in a relationship with an operating system. You should go on a double date with me and my girlfriend. It'll be great. And I think that so nicely captures how when these radical technologies come on the scene, there's this initial oh shit moment followed quickly by acceptance so quickly. And again, I think that's a strength of being human, that we can adapt to new things pretty easily. But I also think it's a vulnerability of being human, because things can really sneak up on us because we become acclimatized to very radical changes so quickly. An example of that in the real world is the smartphone, where, before 2011, smartphones were comparatively rare. 2011, 2012 hits, all of a sudden everyone has a smartphone, and now we just take it for granted fully, to the point where, we're in a position to be exploited, and real harm can come to people by virtue of the use of this technology. In terms of practical takeaways you can get from this film, I think the first one is, and in terms of practical takeaways for this film, I think the first one is technology is really, really ramping up, and we're seeing this all the time. Again, AI has not reached the level of sophistication of Samantha in this film, but clearly there's a lot of progress being made. We need to be prepared for what's going to happen. Things are going to radically change. I think interpersonally, in terms of economics, in terms of what people do for a living, how people have relationships, this is all going to change. I can't really be more specific than that, because totally outside of this field, I don't know what's going to happen, but I do think we need to start at least mentally preparing ourselves and doing everything we can to prepare for some form of radical change. And I think perhaps one of the best ways to be prepared is to double down on what makes us human, to double down on relationships with each other in person, on skills that perhaps only a human being can do or portray that another human might appreciate, on living a life that's not totally dependent on technology, but has some form of independence from technology as well. Psychologically, this film instructs us to learn about our coping strategies and patterns, and learn some alternative ways of dealing with our problems. So in Theodore's case, he only had one tool in his arsenal for dealing with his relationship problems, and that was withdrawing, repressing, running away, maintaining emotional distance. He had to gradually, through his good enough relationship with Samantha, learn some alternative ways, mature, get out of his comfort zone. And I think that's the really big takeaway from this movie. We can't just rely on one coping strategy in terms of how we deal with other people. If we're totally conflict avoidant, we need to learn to start having conflict. If we default to conflict and maybe anger and maybe persecuting our partner, we need to learn perhaps the opposite, maybe some empathy, some curiosity, some connection. But whatever your coping strategies are, it's always good to try and expand them and make them a little bit more sophisticated. Another takeaway from this movie, I think, again, another paradox shown to us by this movie is that good relationships should encourage both parties to grow. Samantha and Theodore both grow within this relationship for different reasons, but sometimes growth can cause a relationship to end. And this is what happens when Samantha continues to grow and grow and grow past the point where the relationship is feasible. So good relationships should encourage both parties to grow, but sometimes growth can cause, unfortunately, a relationship to end. And this is the tragic note that this movie ends on. The last takeaway is, I think everyone in their relationship should think about this idea of constructed compatibility. So this is actually an idea that was discussed by Paul Eastwick, a relationship psychologist who we had on the podcast recently. And he said one of the things that people do in relationships is they construct their own compatibility. We often think that people are either inherently compatible or inherently incompatible, but Paul says the science does not show that to be true at all. Actually, what couples do is they often construct their compatibility through things like shared culture, focusing on the similarities, minimizing the differences, and really constructing between them a story of this is why, I love you, this is why you love me, this is why our relationship works, etc., etc. We actually see this in the film. There's a point where Samantha says, and Samantha's worried about not being human. That's her core insecurity. And she tells Theodore, even though you're human and I'm not, we're all made out of matter. So in that respect, we're at the very least the same. And that's a beautiful example of how someone can, rethink, reframe certain aspects of their relationship to actually improve connectivity. And then I don't think it's a coincidence that when Samantha becomes independent of matter, when she and the other AIs upgrade themselves such that they no longer need physical hardware to run, that's actually when their relationship no longer becomes feasible and their relationship ends at that point. If I had to think about who the psychologically healthiest person in this movie is, I think it's a little bit unfair, but I'm going to give that to Chris Pratt's character, Paul, just because he seems like the most easygoing, takes everything in his stride. He adapts to Theodore's new situation, dating an AI, really easily. He doesn't get insecure about it in terms of his own relationship. He seems to go with the flow. I think it's probably unfair because Paul seems like one of those people who's naturally very not too emotionally sensitive and happy-go-lucky, but he seems to be the character in the film who has, the psychologically healthiest relationship with himself and the people around him. Although I would say, we don't get to know him very well. And it's possible that if we got to know him better, we might see much darker things. How would I rate this movie overall, just as a film? I should say, of course, I'm not a film critic and I have no expertise, but film criticism has much less responsibility than psychiatry or psychotherapy. So I'm quite happy to shoot from the hip and give my opinion on this. I'm going to give this film a 4 out of 5. And I love it because it's quite beautiful, has wonderful set pieces, great acting, a really simple story with a great punchline that's very effective, has a lot to say about our culture, and very, very realistic, as I said before. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 because it's actually not as rewatchable as I thought. So I watched this film back in 2013 and didn't watch it since until I watched it a couple of days ago to do this. And normally when there's that much of a gap, 12 years between one viewing and another, there's a ton of stuff that I would have missed the first time or just forgot about. And funnily enough, I didn't get that with this film. When I watched this film, even though I could still really appreciate it, I didn't feel like the second viewing added that much. And so for that reason alone, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5, not a 5 out of 5. How would I rate this film in terms of psychological accuracy? I actually think, again, even though it's a sci-fi, even though it's quite fantastical, even though it's a future we're not quite at yet, I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5. To me, it came across as really realistic. And if you take for granted that there is technology out there like Samantha and other OSs, I think this is a really realistic portrayal of how things could turn out. I hope you enjoyed discussing this film with me. I definitely enjoyed getting to learn about it and see what were the psychological layers beneath this movie. As I said before, the first time I watched it, it was before I knew anything about psychology. So one thing I was able to appreciate on the second viewing is that there is a lot of psychological depth here. Would love to hear your feedback on these kinds of film analysis episodes. As I said, my plan is to try and do one of these a month. And I'd love to hear what you think, what I got wrong, what I got right, where you agree or disagree. If there's any particular films that you think have a lot of psychological import that you'd like us to discuss, just check out the description and you can follow us on social media or check out our email, and that's a way you can get those suggestions to us. As always, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you here next time.